Mormon Bible. So it's all about the story, and it's about the feeling that you get. And of course, in this sanctuary, you will find that there's a lot of story to be told through the windows. Now, this church was bought, the land was bought by Jane and John Wood in 1870 by the First Society of Methodist Episcopal Church of Sodus Point. The church was called the Methodist Episcopal Church until 1939 because we were basically Anglican because John Wesley was an Anglican priest, and he was our founder. So the land, and after the land was bought, then Charles Hill built the church in 1871, finished in 1872. Does anybody know what other properties he built? He built the yacht club and Guildhall. So he was quite a famous builder. Now the church did not have a basement at the time, so you walked straight in. You didn't climb up those stairs. But in 1889, business was very good with the church because the preacher here had a bunch of tent revivals. So 65 people joined the church that year, and another 72 were baptized. So they decided to put up in the basement. And they asked Charles Hill to come back, and he actually built the entrance to the entrance, and then they put the steps in. But the church men did all the other work. Now, we were the third church. We were the last church in Sodus Point to be built, and we were 20 years younger than Christ Church. There were 600 people in the village. Now, you would think, oh my gosh, how can you sustain, three churches? But people really felt that this community would grow because of the railroad. And they thought that 10,000 people would come to settle. So everyone in the village was very hopeful that that would happen and that it would grow. Now, I want to start in the back of the church with the windows. But first I want to give you an idea. The people in this church wanted to create an environment of warmth and love, and they had a great deal of commitment and love of their faith. So that's what these windows reflect, is the stories that each window tells is a love of the donor's faith and of the recipients, of the person that they were recognizing. This first window is a neo-Gothic design. Now, remember when the Protestants left Europe to escape a religious persecution, the last thing they wanted to have was a lot of horrible memories about how they were persecuted and the restrictions that the church brought to them. So they wanted things very simple. So through the 1700s, you didn't see a lot of stained glass. But in the mid-1800s, there was a resurgence in the U.S., and the first thing that happened was they started copying the great cathedrals. So one of the cathedrals that was typically copied was Chartres Cathedral in northern France. So you would see, especially the colors, the pinks and reds and blues. This is a lancet window, and so this was very typical during the High Victorian period. This was donated by the Epworth League in 1905. The Epworth League was young adult, 18 to 35, and they formed in 1901 in this church. So they actually secured the money and had it put in 1905. Now, you don't have to move unless you want to. One of the things, if you come up here and then you look back at all the windows, that's the only thing that the preacher sees, and it's way different than sitting in the sanctuary looking forward. So when you come to the front of the church and you're looking at all these windows, the view is just mind-blowing. And it's so different than sitting in a pew. This window here, and you really got to come and look at it. So if you want to get up and walk around, you're welcome to do that.
we watch? Okay. I guess we'll watch. Everybody.
These windows were all examples of the American opalescent style. They were based on affordability. They enabled the buyers to have a continuity, and also they were easily customizable. So you had an iridescent quality. They were usually very vivid, and they had the ability to add dashes of color, but it was basically milky glass. This window was a gift from the Sutton family. Now, Charles Sutton, who passed away in the late 1800s, he was the supervisor. He ran the roundhouse at the railroad. His wife, Lizzie, helped work on all the dinners. And of course, the way they raised money for all the incidentals that you needed to run a church was they'd have chicken and biscuit dinners, like we're having downstairs today. So Lizzie worked on that. Their daughter, Grace, was the organist. She married Dan Phillips Jr., who was the son of the lighthouse keeper here in Sodus Point. And then their other son was Clyde. So they donated that window, and then Lizzie donated, Grace donated the other window. So that family felt this scene was very important. The story in the scriptures go, it's Mary and Martha with Jesus. They were Lazarus' sisters. And Mary sat at Jesus' feet to hear Jesus speak, and Martha was very angry. This window is all about priorities. And what God was telling Martha was, you got to get your priorities straight. Mary's priority was straight, and don't take that away from her. So sometimes you have to ask yourself, are you a Mary or are you a Martha? All right. And back in 1928, that pair of windows was $228. That's not Now, this next window, of course, is the next window is the Good Shepherd, and this was in memory of Stephen, Paul, and Rebecca, and then the other window was dedicated by their daughter-in-law for their son Frank, who passed away in 1927. Stephen was a butcher. He died in 1887. And Rebecca died in 1897. They lived on Bay Street, and they were founding members of this church. He was actually one of two of the first class leaders. In the Methodist church, you had class leaders back in the day. And he and William Byes were the two first class leaders, were the first group of members. Now, we know the story of the Good Shepherd. It's from John 10, that he leads the people, but he cares for the people. And of course, that is very, very central to our belief in Christ. So, the way I have a little, I am the Good Shepherd. It's from John 10. The Good Shepherd lays his life down for the sheep. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me. You can see the blues and the opalescent really comes out of this one, especially when you have sunshine. And those windows vary like from 110. One was 110, and the other one was 116 in 1929. This last window on this side. Now, Gordon Williams did a history of the windows and of the church. He called these windows the Fitchy Street windows. So I'm not sure. I guess even though Tinker Pauls lived on Bay Street, they must have been pretty close to Fitchy Street. And the Suttons, Grace Sutton, and her husband lived above the cheese box. He ran the cheese. He actually ran the cheese box, I think. He was a merchant. So these windows are the first window on the left was given by Anna Evans for her husband Remus. Remus and Anna ran the picture theater downtown. And the story goes that that if the film broke in the middle of the movie, that Anna would come out with a big bushel basket full of peanuts and popcorn, and she wouldn't let her husband start the movie back up until it was empty. People used to complain how cold the theater was, and that they could hear the water lapping up against the house or against the building. The next window is from Captain Mize and his wife Anna. Anna was his second wife. His first wife died, and he married his second wife almost immediately. So he was a tugboat captain here in Sodus Bay. He operated the Cornelia for 27 years, and he was originally captain of schooners on the Great Lakes. So his wife must have made him settle down, so that he worked on day job as much as a day job as he could on a tug. His wife Anna was a Sunday school teacher. She worked for the Ladies Aid Society, and she ran a boarding house on North Fitchie Street.
Laurie, I can tell you it's hard to get a bike to settle down.
Yes. That's right, Sadie.
The cheese box the cheese box was on the Four Corners, and it's now it's a privately owned place, but it's right there on the south side of the Four Corners. There used to be a store when I grew up. I'm sorry.
Salty's had it.
Salty's had it, yeah. Right. Yeah. And this window, now there's a lot of symbolism in this window. That's what stained glass is all about. So the deer, people may not realize it, but the deer symbolizes the need for people to recognize their inner treasures and how important it is to share your inner treasures and be gracious and generous with your inner treasures with other people. And of course, now the sheep, represent God's people, but the sheep also represent calmness and good living, and the water, of course, represents the gift of life and purity and cleansing, and then of course the valleys represent the promised land and fertility. So when I look at this, I always am drawn to Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, and so that is always something that clicks with me when I look at this window. Now, I'm going to go back up to the window up here at the very end. The window on the left was donated by the trustees of the church in memory of Charles Castle and his wife. Charles Castle's estate left $1,000 to this church in 1926. And so what the trustees did was they used that money to do a ton of repairs on the parsonage and on the church. So it was really a godsend for them to receive that $1,000. That was huge back then. And they had enough money left over to give recognition to Mr. Castle for this window. So this was $116 in 1928. And Charles Castle and his wife, they had a place on South Shore. They had a cottage on South Shore. So they were members of this church. So now the one on the left, the next window on the left here, it was a gift from Mr. and Mrs. William York. Agnes was the woman. It's funny how very few of these have women's names, and it took me a while to find these women's names, but her name was Agnes. So William was he was called the saint of the church. He did everything. he was 40 years a trustee, and he did the clerk work, so that was an additional set of keeping the books and stuff of the work required of the trustees. He also was the Sunday school superintendent for 35 years. He was the janitor. He was the carpenter. He fixed everything. He was a blacksmith. He had a bunch of gold teeth. And it was said that he could make anything out of metal. So he took over. He also ran the roundhouse after Mr. Sutton retired. So he did that. Now this window, the imagery of this window is really important too. This is this guy doesn't tend sheep. He's holding a walking stick, but he's dressed in very fine clothing. So you have a feeling of majesty when you look at him. He's overlooking the land from a high point. So this demonstrates the majesty of God and how God views everything and how he can see all the obstacles below. You can see the valleys and all the things that you have to be careful of. And it teaches us that we have to look for those things and not count so much the things right in front of us, but really look out for things farther out, and to recognize that God is in charge and that he's looking out for us. He's watching everything that happens. Now, the next window, if you ever talked to Nancy Karasinski, she was a member here, she would tell you that there are 3 lighthouses in Sodus Point. So you're looking at the 3rd one. So now she, Daniel Phillips, this was dedicated to Daniel Phillips and his wife Julia Finch, which is really neat. He was the longest-serving lighthouse keeper in Sodus Point. And these windows were all installed between 1928 and 1929. So she was still alive at that time, but her husband, who was also William, passed away in 1924. She had 5 children, and she lived on the corner corner of Margaretta and what was then called the Alton Road, which is Route 14. And I think that her son dedicated that window to her because she must have had a pretty hard time after her husband died, and she was still able to raise them all. Her son William also worked for the railroad. Her husband William was actually the foreman of the trestle during that time. And then on the right is the window that was donated by Garlock. Yeah, I can't remember why can't I remember his name? George R. Garlock. He was a baggage master and on the railroad. She died in 1929, so it must have been immediately, since the windows were all put in by 1929, she must have just died. And so he loved her so much that he donated that window. And of course, we know the story here. It's in all four Gospels, but it's the basis of our belief in faith and in salvation. So it's very important. Now, there's one more window. So, and I'll just